Hello and welcome back. So now we'll get into our two Gen X microgenerations, which are Gen XS, for excess, not for extra small, and Gen Xenos, also known as Generation Golf in Germany, Second Baby Boomers in Japan, the Rising Generation in Australia, and in some parts of the US, the Oregon Trail generation, which is a reference to a video game that a lot of members of this generation used how to learn technology on. So let's kick off with Gen XS. Now for Gen XS's formative years, once again, we see some occurrences that we also saw with our neo-boomer from the last module, except this time they of course happen at a later time in their life. So, for example, the idea of that pop culture specifically targeted toward young people continued on with Gen XS's childhood. However, at the same time, they happened to be born to parents who were focused in on their careers, similar to what we saw with the leading boomer, which did impact the way that they thought about their own personal success in the future. Now, into their adolescence, this idea of consumption and pop culture continues on, but this generation also happens to see terrible things happen in the world through their television sets. So there's this feeling of being spectators, but not necessarily being participants. Now, into their adulthood, we see this idea of power shifts across the world, as well as this focus on self-preservation, again, similar to what we saw with the neo-boomer, except this time less about taking personal action and more about a sense of protection. So the piece of media for Gen XS is The Breakfast Club. Obviously one of John Hughes' bests. Everybody knows this movie, but for a quick rundown of what it's all about, basically, in the 80s, 5 teenagers who couldn't be more different at face value all get detention on a Saturday, which I'm sure in 2020 is illegal. But don't worry about them because detention ends up being a lot of fun. They do drugs together, they dance together, they give each other makeovers, and then they have this really sad group therapy session that leads them all to becoming the closest friends any of them has ever had, which reminds them that maybe they're not as alone as they thought. But one thing that I find is not discussed often enough about The Breakfast Club is the role of the parents in the film. Now, the parents in The Breakfast Club sort of serve as the meter stick by which the audience can measure how much each of the teenagers has changed throughout the duration of the film. They also show us why each of the teenagers is the way that they are, basically showing that Gen XS's family is their original tribe. Now, there are tons of examples of this. For example, the athlete's father tells him boys will be boys. The bad kid arrives alone on foot. And it really gives us an idea of why each of these characters is who they are. And again, also shows us that family has always been Gen X's main tribe, for better or for worse. Now, that's still the case today. 47% of Gen Xers are supporting both a parent and child, if not multiple, financially. About 68% of them are primary providers of the household. And in 2020, they're very family-focused and constantly multitasking because of it. Now, as a result, we see things like mundane multitask, which is an insight on Trend Hunter that shows an array of services that provide the kind of productivity tips that we typically associate with the workplace, except now for one's home life. The idea of having to juggle home and work in that work-life balance, needing additional assistance through technology. Now, what will that mean for Gen XS in 2025? Well, hopefully they'll be able to revolutionize what work-life balance even looks like. Unfortunately, Generation X is the least promoted generation in the workplace, but they're next in line for those leadership positions, that is, if the boomer ever decides to retire. Familial Workplace shows what I believe the future could be if Gen XS takes over those leadership positions in their own corporate culture, basically revolutionizing what it means to have a more familial-focused workplace. Now, a great example of this already exists with the Cliff Bar office and their very family-friendly space, as well as services like The Workaround. Now, The Workaround is a parent-friendly shared workspace in Toronto that isn't just dedicated to providing parents with an opportunity to work while also having childcare available to them, but doing so in a way that's accessible for people of all financial backgrounds. So how do you create the future for Gen XS? Well, foster trust with this busy generation by being no frills and being reliable for them. Help them spend their free time making memories with the people they love, because that's what they really focus in on. know that they're family people, meaning what's good for the kids is considered good for them, and they actually have the highest household spend among all microgenerations due to a love of convenience and comfort. Now we get into the younger set of Gen X, Gen Xenos. Now, Gen Xenos' formative years start with this era of inherited anxiety in their childhood. Unfortunately, once again, we see bad things happening in the world that this generation is consuming through the television, but it impacts their parents in a way that creates a sort of fear-based environment, and this generation becomes quite risk-averse as a result. Adolescents sort of follow suit with that, and we see the rise of pessimism and irreverence in pop culture. Now, this gifts us some really great things, like The Simpsons and grunge music, but it also changes the way this generation thinks about themselves and about others. Now, into adolescence, the idea that this generation are natural-born misfits, but also quite risk-averse, comes to a head, and we see some contradictions in their own personal perception. Now, the piece of media for Gen Xenos is Fight Club. Now, Fight Club is a very interesting movie. It's a little bit difficult to explain the plot because it gets a little complex, but the basic idea is that there are two characters. The narrator, who is a very risk-averse person who's getting sort of fed up with the mundanity of his day-to-day life, and the friend that he meets, Tyler Durden, who represents this idea of rebellion and mischief. Now, to alleviate any tension the two of them feel about their day-to-day lives, they start fighting each other in organized settings. Now, where it gets interesting is when it's revealed, and this is a spoiler alert, by the way, that they're one and the same person. Yes, so the narrator has split personality disorder, and the idea is that these are two sides of the same coin. And in fact, we see the same thing with other members of Gen Xenos. They're caught between two worlds. Webster's dictionary says that they were too young for Voltron, but also too old for Power Rangers. Gen Xenos are natural-born misfits because they tend to have to sit in the middle of two very different worlds. Now, the good news is that being a misfit can often create for very creative minds. You get people like Brian Chesky, who's a part of this generation, Jordan Peele, also a member of Gen Xenos, Jack Dorsey, and love her or hate her, Kim Kardashian West, who did indeed create her own business category. This may also be why 42 is the average age of startup founder. Now, what does that mean for Gen Xenos in 2020? Well, obviously they want fulfilling careers. Considering the difficulty of their childhood, they are quite risk-averse, but they also want a sense of stability. However, at the same time, they want to do it their own way, because they can't deny the fact that they are people who think a little differently than everyone else. And so we see things like Evolved Rebellion. Evolved Rebellion is all about taking that young Gen X stereotype, that young rebel, and repurposing it for adults. But for 2025, this generation will no longer be satisfied with being the rock star of their office, and they'll want to start their own businesses, which we see with incremental entrepreneurship. 65% of Gen X workers already know that they no longer want to work in an office, and a third of younger Gen Xers, so Gen Xenos specifically, wants to start their own business. However, just because this generation is not as family-focused as their older predecessor doesn't mean that they aren't still the head of household. And so they recognize that they have to start their own businesses in a small way that doesn't disrupt their day-to-day life. That's where we see incremental entrepreneurship, which is an insight that looks at services that help people start their own businesses in baby steps, things like UpMetrics, for example. So how do you create the future for Gen Xenos? Know that they are brand loyal as long as you're an innovative brand. They are independent thinkers, and so they prefer to be given facts through their communication and marketing so that they can make their own decisions. Do not try to box this generation in. They consider themselves to be quite unique. And know that they love analog, but they highly value digital. This is your key consumer when it comes to things like omnichannel. So that wraps up our module on our Gen X microgenerations. One key takeaway is that both of the Generation X microgenerations are trying to balance between personal desires and familial responsibilities. I have a quick comparison chart across the two microgenerations here, as well as those workshop questions. So first, how could your brand provide busy Gen Xers with a sense of relief? And Gen Xers are notorious for trusting themselves first. How can you as a brand work around that? All right, see you in our next module on the millennial microgenerations.